After half a century of dictatorship, the Assad regime of Syria has finally crumbled to the ground. It took nearly 14 years of war, incredible casualties, millions of people displaced, an unspeakable human tragedy. But finally, the father-son dynasty that dominated Syria for so long has been condemned to history. Now, if you'd like to learn about the shock offensive that took Bashar al-Assad and his cronies down, to learn about the battles and tactics that made a rebel victory possible, well, you're in luck because we recently published a video about that. So you can check it out after this video if you want to. But today, instead of looking back, we're going to turn our attention forward in time. The Assad regime has fallen. Yes, and that is a great victory for the nation of Syria. But what happens now? The nation remains divided between powerful armed factions. Its people will have to find a way for rebels and regime collaborators to live peacefully, and its place on the world stage will need to be thoroughly recalibrated or even reimagined from the ground up. With any luck, the battles in Syria might finally be over, but the process of peace has only just begun, and if history around the world is any indication, then Syria's most difficult moments may still lie ahead. Alright, before we dive in today, we're going to issue our usual caveat whenever we discuss a current and evolving world event. The situation in Syria is still a very fluid thing right now, and everything from boundaries of territorial control to the identities of people in charge to the extent of foreign involvement are all liable to change, both before this episode is released and in the time afterward when information will eventually just go out of date. As a result, we'll specify that everything that we discuss in this episode is up to date as of 12:01 a.m., the start of the day, on Wednesday, the 11th of December 2024, local time in Damascus. In the event of any great upheaval after that, you can rest assured that we will release follow-up episodes in due time. Alright, so the immediate aftermath of the rebel takeover of Damascus has generated a wide range of interesting, colorful, and often quite unreliable maps of who controls what. In order to explain the state of affairs in Syria, however, we're going to use one particular map as a primary point of reference, adding in context and additional information as necessary. That map comes via the Institute for the Study of War, namely a figure called Reported Control of Terrain in Syria. Yet, again, just to be clear, this is not the only descriptor of territorial control that we're referencing, it's just a starting point. As for the forces that currently hold land in Syria, the obvious one to start with is the organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, better known as HTS. This organization that most directly brought about the fall of Damascus with a cascading offensive that started at the fringes of the province where HTS had been at its strongest, the governorate of Idlib. From there, HTS had crashed eastward to Aleppo and then south to the city of Hama, then to the key city of Homs, and finally to the capital of Damascus. Right now, HTS holds direct control over all 5 of those cities, and going by pre-war census figures, that grants HTS control over 4 of the 5 most populous cities in all of Syria. The only other city within the top 5 is called Latakia. It's Syria's premier port city, and while HTS doesn't hold direct control of the city at present, its and its southerly neighbor Tartus are cut off from the rest of Syria by a continuous line of HTS territory. Although HTS fighters and civil administrators haven't yet parked themselves in many of Syria's outlying towns, they hold functional control over much of west-central Syria, including a range of oil and gas fields to the southeast of Homs. Owing to their direct hold on Damascus, HTS and their civilian leadership wing, the Syrian Salvation Government, have laid the groundwork for a transitional administration. The transitional government was given a major gift just hours after the Assad regime fell, when the final prime minister of the Syrian Arab Republic, Mohammed Ghazi al-Jalali, agreed to lead in a caretaker capacity. Rather than just being a naked power play, the offer had the potential to be very important in the early days of reconciliation, when former Syrian army soldiers, regime officials, intelligence officers, civil administrators, and more would have had to live alongside the very same rebels who overthrew them. Not only that, but they've had to live amongst newly liberated ordinary Syrians who'd lived under their yoke for many years, learned their faces, names, habits, and would no doubt seek retribution. HTS and its leaders have issued a broad amnesty to regime officials and soldiers, and on both sides there's a strong focus on avoiding retributive action. Nonetheless, former Prime Minister al-Jalali lasted only 1 day in his caretaker role before transitioning power to the Prime Minister of HTS's Syrian Salvation Government, a man named Mohammed al-Bashir. HTS, and with it the corresponding civilian administration, are an interesting and complex force in modern Syria. In the United States, Russia, the European Union, and elsewhere, they're designated as a terror organization, and they were, at one time, an al-Qaeda affiliate with strong links to the Islamic State. They've also been accused of widespread repression in the province of Idlib over the last half-decade, including the mass imprisonment of critics and dissidents against their rule. But at the same time, they've also taken pains to distance themselves from their jihadist past and portray themselves as a moderate, trustworthy force. Since taking Damascus, their leadership has called for the protection of all minorities in Syria, explicitly including non-Muslims, and has gone out of its way to make statements discouraging retribution against state officials. Their Syrian Salvation government has worked hard to clean up unexploded ordnance, restore basic services, and set up a local administration in areas they've taken over, especially Aleppo. And in the past, they've been responding to public outcry, even releasing hundreds of imprisoned dissidents in response to a protest movement earlier in 2024. They are, again, a very complex organization with a very complex history, and it will be their actions, not their rhetoric, that will show their true colors in time. But as for what those true colors will eventually prove to be, we'll just have to watch and find out. Across the country, the other most powerful force in Syria is the Kurdish-led autonomous state of Rojava, backed up by its fighting wing, the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. Kurdish Rojava has long held territory north and east of the Euphrates River, in areas where the Kurds have historically exerted informal control within Syria and where Rojava held a mostly quiet front line with the Syrian regime until a few days ago. During the chaos of the rebel offensive in December, Rojava and the SDF claimed chunks of territory on what was formerly the regime side of the Euphrates, as well as a large patch of land in the north-central portion of the country. Broadly, though, the Kurds declined to take the opportunity to attack targets that were within their reach in favor of consolidating their positions, keeping their hold over critical territory, and watching to see what came next. The reason for their hesitation is the next faction to discuss, the so-called Syrian Interim Government, shortened to SNA. The SNA is backed directly by Syria's northern neighbor, the more powerful and more wealthy nation of Turkey, and they hold territory in Syria's northwest corner. They fought alongside HDS during the latter group's attack on Aleppo, and they captured territory of their own, although they largely stayed clear of the fighting once it progressed southward. In addition to the SNA, Turkey holds a large stretch of territory itself along the northern border between its own land and Syria. That territory cuts into Kurdish Rojava, where it's surrounded to the east, south, and west by Kurdish forces. Turkey has a very long, very bloody relationship with the Middle East's Kurdish population, and while it mostly concerns itself with Kurds on its own territory, it's launched large-scale airstrikes on Rojava as recently as the autumn of 2024. Finally, there are a handful of other land-holding factions to touch on before we move into discussions of a peace and reconstruction process. In the south, autonomous and loosely collaborative rebel factions hold most territory in the provinces of Daraa and Suwaida, although they lack the sort of broad, overarching state infrastructure that HTS has in the Syrian Salvation Government, or that the Kurds have in Rojava. To the southeast, US-backed Syrian fighters hold a large patch of mostly empty desert and surged northward to capture the central city of Palmyra. In addition to Turkey, 3 other key nations hold at least some territory in Syria. Russia holds multiple air and naval bases that it still occupies at the time of writing, while about 900 troops maintain a deconfliction zone in the southeast, and Israel has surged troops into a buffer zone northeast of the disputed Golan Heights after the Assad regime's collapse. And finally, the Islamic State holds scattered small villages and hamlets across the open desert, and it's active in large portions of the Syrian countryside, amidst what regional experts have warned is a years-long reconsolidation of their forces. All right, so we got to the trouble of laying out each of those factions, not just to belabor the point that Syria is currently a very complicated place, but because every single one of those organizations will have to be taken into account in the effort to establish a lasting peace. Each of them is well armed. Most are empowered directly or indirectly by at least one major foreign backer, and many of them have a long and difficult history with each other in a situation where achieving true peace is a lot easier said than it is done. Right now, the effort to establish a path forward is still in its early stages, when interesting ideas are abundant and detailed actionable plans are still scarce. But the early signs coming out of Damascus are at least not outwardly concerning. Although HTS installed its own prime minister at the head of the new transitional government, the organization continues to work with the ex-prime minister of the Assad regime and other key officials to establish a peaceful transfer of power. HTS's leader, widely referred to as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, but now going by his birth name Ahmed al-Sharaa, has emphasized that a return to violent conflict doesn't appear to be in the cards. Quoting an interview with Sky News here, "People are exhausted from war, so the country isn't ready for another one, and it's not going to get into another one. Al-Sharaa has emphasized the removal of Iran-backed militias from Syria, completing a de-Iranization of a nation that was until recently Tehran's closest sovereign ally in all of the Middle East. His transitional government has already announced plans for economic reforms with the intent of shifting away from the Assad regime's policy of state-controlled economics and toward a free market system that would see Syria reintegrate with the global economy. Ongoing meetings between the new PM and members of the former Assad government are meant to, quote, restart the institutions to be able to serve our people in Syria and to, quote, facilitate all the necessary works for the next 2 months until we have a constitutional system to be able to serve the Syrian people, end quote. Now, according to the transition government, the total transition period in Syria is now expected to last about 18 months in total, with hopes of drafting a new constitution at the end of an initial 6-month period of stabilization. But already, concern has cropped up across Syria and the international community around HTS's apparently limited overtures towards either Kurdish Rojava, the Turkish-backed SNA, or any other rebel group or organization. For all its talk of inclusive process, HTS has thus far worked to implement unilateral control over the transition. It hasn't looped in Rojava, the SNA, the Alternative National Coalition government currently headquartered in Turkey, or others. Granted, we should point out, it's still early in the process, and international arbiters who might more easily network with different sides of the Syrian conflict have yet to arrive. But it will take more than just HTS to form a real, stable government across all of Syria, and we have yet to see the group take steps to engage with a wide coalition of interests in the country. In the meantime, stability across most of the nation is holding, for now, including in areas that HTS controls directly. Public accounts from Damascus, Aleppo, and elsewhere within Syria broadly express a feeling of safety, security, and hesitant acceptance of HTS as life goes back to normal. One particularly common statement is that although things might get bad under HTS, it's difficult to envision a way that they could get worse than what Syria's experienced recently. If an ISIS caliphate scores 10 of 10 on a scale of bad outcomes, and the Assad regime scores a 9, then HTS scoring an 8 or lower would constitute improvement. Hopefully, of course, Syria's next leaders will do a good bit better than that. Then there's the reconstruction process itself, where although a full and detailed nationwide assessment has yet to be completed, the early figures are daunting. Back in 2021, the cost of reconstruction was thought to be at about $250 billion, and that figure will likely have gone up with the events of late 2024. The country's economic collapse will have to be factored in, as will Syria's debts to Iran, currently estimated in the tens of billions of dollars. The future of international sanctions against Syria remains to be seen, especially in the event that HTS, a designated terror organization across much of the world, does take unilateral control. Not only that, but with the US skeptical, Iran and Russia scorned, China looking to keep a low profile, and Turkey and Israel jockeying for geopolitical influence, the question of who might foot the bill on reconstruction has yet to be answered. Internationally, though, there are some bright spots and a few early indicators that global forces may try and engage with the process of rebuilding Syria. The United States, for example, has emphasized that its foreign terrorist organization designation against HTS won't bar it from starting a dialogue, and that the nation's current outgoing administration would consider revoking that status if HTS can meet certain conditions. The UK and the EU tend to follow the US's example on such things, and the UN has indicated that it may consider removing HTS's terror classification as well. UN officials have expressed broad optimism thus far over how the transition has gone, although that optimism is, understandably, really rather cautious. Meanwhile, Iran has opened its own direct communications with HTS and has advocated a nationwide conference of Syria's various opposed parties. Iranian officials speaking to Western press have expressed that Iran's focus is to keep Syria as firmly under Iran's umbrella as possible. Quoting one official here, "The main concern for Iran is whether Assad's successor will push Syria away from Tehran's orbit. That is a scenario Iran is keen to avoid." End quote. As for Russia, Vladimir Putin claims not to have met with Bashar al-Assad, who he's hosting in Moscow, and purportedly doesn't plan to meet with him anytime soon. Russia's engagement with HTS has consisted of a series of terse exchanges around the fate of Russia's military bases and personnel in the country, although those talks appear to have resolved in Russia's favor, at least for now. Despite pullbacks from many of Russia's smaller outposts, the nation has showed no signs of withdrawal from its major naval base at Tartus or its major air base in Latakia. For Russia, maintaining access to those bases is very important. Quoting a Russian state TV presenter explaining the situation on Telegram, quoting here, "Obviously, if we lose the bases in Syria, we lose Africa. It'll be almost impossible to fly cargo to the CAR or Mali. Well, we'll develop Siberia instead." End quote. While HTS leaders have guaranteed the safety of Russia's bases for now, Russian mill bloggers indicate that the situation remains tense and that those guarantees may not last long. Meanwhile, there's a somewhat happier issue to consider: the mass return of millions of refugees who've been living outside Syria, some of them for upward of the last decade. HTS has issued an open invitation to all Syrians living abroad to finally return home, and some of them may be able to do so quickly. About 3 million Syrians live in Turkey, and the nation had announced plans to resettle those Syrians back in their home nation before Damascus had even fallen, back when the HTS shock offensive had only captured Aleppo. Foreign leaders have echoed those calls, including the leaders of Denmark and Austria on Tuesday the 10th, both seeking to alleviate the pressure of a long-running Syrian refugee presence in those countries. Other leaders around the world, including some in the Syrian diaspora, have emphasized patience in order to see how the situation shakes out. The diaspora community, however, has been the subject of broad press attention around the globe, and for the most part, Syrian refugees have made clear their desire to return home. So, in broad strokes, those are the developments that indicate things might be going right in Syria, and that this tentative, fragile reconstruction effort might ultimately bear fruit. But before we close out today's episode, we've got to take a look at the other side of the equation, at the lingering stress points and cause for concern that Syria must deal with before their hard-won victory over Assad can become a true peace. First and foremost, as the dust settles over Damascus, the world has quickly woken up to the reality that elsewhere across Syria, there's a real risk of continued violence at scale. One such flashpoint comes in and around the city of Manbij in the north, where Kurdish forces have been in control until December the 8th, just hours after the Assad regime crumbled. There, even as most of Syria were celebrating victory, the Turkish-backed SNA were taking advantage of the confusion to attack the Kurds in that area. Despite fierce resistance, the SNA was able to take over most of the region in hours. The fighting reportedly left hundreds dead and ended with a deal between the US and Turkey so that the US-backed Kurds could withdraw without further bloodshed. This retreat followed earlier Kurdish withdrawals from areas where Turkish-backed forces were advancing and led Kurdish fighters to leave behind enclaves of their own people in and around Aleppo. In the days since, Turkish aircraft have carried out their own strikes on Kurdish positions, and HTS military leaders have claimed that they've pushed Kurdish forces entirely out of the eastern city of Deir ez-Zor. They reportedly encountered only minimal resistance in doing so. The mere fact that violence would still be ongoing in Syria after the fall of Assad is trouble enough, but in this case, it speaks to the particular problem faced by the Kurds in this new order. Turkey has long vilified the Kurdish population of both its own nation and Syria, especially the autonomous Rojava. The fact that Syria has now been taken over by HTS, whose relations with Turkey are quite cordial in practice, and that HTS was supported by the same Turkish-backed rebels who have since pushed the Kurds out of Manbij, is widely recognized as a bad sign for Kurdish forces and their people. In a vacuum, of course, the fall of the Assad regime could be an opportunity for the Kurds. They, a major land-holding power within the country, could have a chance to become active participants in a new Syrian state, carving out special provisions or retaining autonomy on the lands they control. Perhaps they could even realize the long-held ambition of all of Kurdistan: sovereignty, negotiated as part of a peace agreement that subdivides lands where the very concept of Syria may no longer reflect the reality on the ground. Instead, the opposite appears to be what's coming. A difficult outcome, but certainly one of the less ruinous options, would be for Rojava to be pushed back to territory within the bounds of the Euphrates and forced to accept and resettle displaced Kurds who had been forced from their homes elsewhere. An outcome that could be a few ticks worse is that the Turkish-backed rebels and HTS turn their military attention northward, opening a battlefront against a new enemy whilst writing the Kurds out of any settlements coming from Damascus. Worst of all is the possibility that Turkey, confronting only a very weak government in Damascus, might take its chance and launch a large-scale offensive against Rojava directly, with potentially catastrophic effect. To be clear, there are less bad alternatives that could be framed as a win for Turkey, accepting Kurdish statehood in Rojava, for example, and then forcibly relocating all of Turkey's own Kurds there as well. It's not an easy or a kind solution, but certainly it's easier than all-out war. But for now, everything from stalemate to war appears to be on the table. Deeply interlinked with the question of territorial control is the question of oil. Syria doesn't produce much in the way of oil compared to most nations that drill for the stuff, mostly due to a crush of international sanctions. But Syria itself does depend on what oil it can harvest, and right now the Kurdish-led SDF control many of Syria's biggest oil fields, backed up by the United States. That oil, as well as natural gas, is likely to be a major source of future division inside Syria, and it's a problem that can quickly go international, with Shell and Total Energies each maintaining a broad presence in Syria. The role of the United States in backing up Kurdish oil holdings is sure to become a problem for everybody from Turkey to Iran to Russia and more. The Russian military also controls oil fields within Syria, so as long as that's the case, two of the world's most important and most starkly opposed nations will be financially entwined with the outcome of Syria's transition process. Then there are the Alawites, members of the same religious sect as Bashar al-Assad, his father Hafez, and many of the leaders within his government. Rather than face widespread retributive attacks, as many Alawites had feared, they've been treated with a far more open mind by HTS and its allies. In Bashar al-Assad's majority Alawite hometown, local elders pledged their support to HTS, a move that many other Alawite communities have since copied. Unfortunately, both sides know all too well that such a facade would be easy enough to maintain for a few days if it was indeed disingenuous. But at least for now, HTS does appear to be genuine in its overtures to the community. That is a direct rebuttal to the party line the Assad regime fed the Alawites for decades, promising that if Assad ever fell, the minority community would be massacred. It's also a way to leave an open door for former regime officials to come into the fold, trusting that between assurances to their Alawite community and broader commitments to amnesty, they may not have anything to fear. While HTS has been clear that they, quote, will not hesitate to hold accountable the criminals, murderers, security and army officers involved in torturing the Syrian people, the signals they've sent to the Alawite community and other ex-regime personnel seem to have reassured people that they'll just be going after high-ranking or particularly monstrous individuals. A harder problem to deal with is the Islamic State, whose fighters still run free across Syria's open wastes and are getting stronger by the day. Since the fall of the Assad regime, US warplanes have carried out airstrikes against Islamic State targets, but the limited actions by the US and the Syrian commandos and SDF forces they partner with aren't nearly enough to get the job done by themselves. The Islamic State loves a power vacuum, and it's got a massive one to exploit across Syria, especially in the empty heartlands where no group can really assert control. Their goals now appear less focused on territorial consolidation than they used to be, but even still, such massive swaths of land offer the potential for widespread asymmetric attacks, the planting of roadside bombs, the gathering and training of large bands of fighters, and the takeover of small towns and villages that could supply a power base. Even worse, any large-scale moves against the Kurds could end up swelling the ranks of the Islamic State. Thousands of Islamic State fighters are currently held in Kurdish prisons, but the Kurds have made no secret of the fact that if they're forced to choose between defending their people and protecting the prisons, they'll choose their own people. Vacate the prisons, and mass jailbreaks could very quickly follow, refilling the ranks of an organization that's smarter and more cunning than it was even at the height of its power. And speaking of problems that are hard to solve, we turn to Israel. In the hours following the overthrow of Assad, IDF troops surged into Syria past the disputed territory of the Golan Heights in order to carve out a buffer zone between themselves and Syria's armed factions. In the initial push, Israel took over a chunk of territory several kilometers deep, including Mount Hermon, a strategically vital point of high ground that offers a vantage point over much of the border zone. There they can maintain a presence just 40 kilometers away from Damascus, although new reports suggest that the IDF has pushed even further, potentially as close as 25 kilometers from the city. The IDF denies these claims. In the area it's taken over, Israel explains its moves as an attempt to create a, quote, sterile defensive zone. Defense Minister Israel Katz described it as a demilitarized zone. Meanwhile, Jerusalem has attempted to place heavy rhetorical pressure on the new leaders in Damascus, with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu threatening retribution if Iran is allowed to re-establish its presence there. Quoting Netanyahu here, if this regime allows Iran to re-establish itself in Syria, or permits the transfer of Iranian weapons or any other weapons to Hezbollah, or if it attacks us, we will respond forcefully and we will exact a heavy price. End quote. Attacking from the sky, Israel claims to have hit Syria with upward of 480 airstrikes within just a 48-hour stretch since the fall of the Assad regime. The Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, claim to have, quote, struck most of the strategic weapons stockpiles in Syria, preventing them from falling into the hands of terrorist elements. Among the hardware that Israel claims to have destroyed are anti-air batteries, warplanes, and combat helicopters, about 15 naval vessels, and factories and infrastructure for weapons production, collectively constituting 80% of the Syrian army's military capabilities prior to the fall of Assad. Israel is also believed to have struck a range of sites tied to the Assad government's long-running chemical weapons program. Finally, there's the question of humanitarian work. In an environment where most of the groups that aid organizations could liaise with are designated by somebody or another as a terrorist organization. For their part, HTS has reportedly done a good job opening up bread lines, redistributing fuel and water, and supplying other basic needs in the areas they control. But those initiatives can only last so long on limited resources, and they'll take away from the civil manpower needed to stabilize and push for a peace in the area. Now that the fighting has ended, it'll be vital to surge international aid to much of the country where food, fuel, and medicine shortages are expected to be widespread. For their part, HTS has recognized the ways in which their terrorist designation could stand in the way of the proper delivery of aid, and the group is committed to running captured territory through third-party administrators and an overarching transitional government that can do business much easier. With luck, that decision will coincide with foreign governments lifting restrictions on the flow of aid into Syria and a potential jumpstart to the reconstruction effort. Now, we've said it before, and we'll say it again. This is an extremely fragile moment for Syria and for every person, organization, and nation with a stake in Syria's future. Very little about these coming months will be easy, but failure to reach a lasting peace at this juncture can and will have catastrophic consequences. As Syria's future evolves, we'll be here to talk about it. And until then, let's hold out hope that this utterly shattered nation may finally start to heal. Thanks for watching.